wonderful appreciation for the ocean. So, building a career, buying real estate, investing, doing all this cool stuff, having children. Now I'm at a stage where I'm retired and I can focus all my energies onto what I love, and that's the ocean. And unfortunately, coral reefs are suffering really, really hard and badly right now. So that's the reason why I picked coral as my focus. There's tons and tons of problems in this planet right now, but you got to pick one, and this is the one I picked. And as far as I'm concerned, it's probably one of the hardest ones out of all that you could pick. But my passions are with the ocean, so that's why I decided to go that way.
And why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult?
Well, so I could have started an organization called Counting Trees, right? And we could have gone and planted millions and millions of trees. And a good example of this is Ethiopia planted 360 million trees in 24 hours, beating the Indian record of 300 million trees in 24 hours. We have the ability to be able to save this planet in terms of carbon sequestration and all the rest of it, right? Now, you try and get 1,000 people in the ocean to plant coral. You have to start off with probably a $750 certification. Then that's just your beginning certification. Then you probably want to get your second certification and an advanced and rescue certification. So you're looking at $5,000 just to be safe in the water, feeling comfortable that you could actually dive down and start to plant coral. Then you've got to be in these tropical locations, or you have to travel there. Then you have the expense of the boat operators, because boat operators don't do this for free unless you're lining up with an organization. So by the time you get done, you're like $8,000 to $10,000. You're at this boat, you jump in the water. Guess what? You've got an hour. You plant coral, you come up. You've got to wait, go back another hour. Now, you can imagine how difficult that is to motivate even 1,000 people to say, hey, go spend $8,000 and come help me plant coral. It's really, really difficult. It's one of the hardest projects out there right now.
So it's almost like if you're really going to do it realistically, you would have to get local governments involved in making that restoration effort rather than having individuals do it, because most people don't have $8,000, $10,000 to spend on anything, let alone planting coral. And as you mentioned, these there's a lot of communities there where maybe that kind of money is not readily available to most folks. So what does Counting Coral do? What's your unique approach to bringing awareness to saving coral reefs?
Well, I mean, that's a good word, is the awareness, right? So when I looked at how I could participate in helping coral reefs and saving coral reefs, you have to come up with some sort of model that benefits everybody. So in other words, I could jump in the water, scrounge maybe 10 grand's worth of donations and go and plant 1,000 pieces of coral. Nobody knows about it. Nobody cares, right? You're under the surface of the ocean. Then I could take a picture of it, say, hey, look, I've just planted 1,000 corals, but that falls flat too because everybody's seen a picture of a coral. Everybody's seen a picture of a fish. Where's the awareness driver there when it's business as usual? There's no change. So I, had to really think about how I could make an impact in a full circle sort of way. So I decided to create these sculptural art pieces out of stainless steel, which is a non-ferrous material that lasts an incredible long time in the ocean. Now, I designed them to be coral nurseries, and then just by happenstance, they become artificial reefs. Even though they're not designed to be long-term artificial reefs, that's just what they become. Fish hang out in them, they hide in them. There's a little sanctuary for them while the corals are growing. Now, these corals can grow on these sculptures, and then they can be harvested, placed onto a secondary nursery to grow out a little bit more, and then go onto the reef, or they can be harvested and be planted directly onto the reef. Now, the benefits of doing that is kind of a threefold thing. So when you plant these sculptural gardens, you're essentially donating them to organizations that are doing this work. So in other words, I'm not a reef restorator. I'm not going and collecting that coral. I'm just providing a nursery. So these guys have this really cool tool to work with because it's not ropes hanging in the ocean. It's not these plastic coral trees that we grow coral on. This is a substrate that's solid and fixed to the ocean floor. So these guys have that added benefit. Now, we don't go into the middle of the ocean in the middle of nowhere where no one sees it or no one knows about it. We put it in areas where there are dive operators and there are local communities that need help. So in other words, these communities have kind of broken down these reefs over years of fishing and potentially dynamite fishing, cyanide fishing. I mean, there's a lot of bad practices that weren't understood at that time, and now they're being understood that are hugely detrimental to reefs. But you have to get these communities organized and invested in what you're doing. So we plant these sculptures. Dive operators now have an added revenue stream and an added marketing scheme. So when tourists come in, they can say, hey, come and dive on this cool site. Take some pictures for Instagram. This is what we're doing. That's the awareness driver. But you've also got the revenue driver. Then we ask these dive operators as a collective to upcharge to these divers, maybe $5, $10, or whatever they see fit for the location. And we donate that monies to community projects. So we are installing in Fiji, for example, and Fiji is a very hard-hit country when it comes to any investment into the local peoples. They are still in grass huts. They don't have electricity. They barely have running water. So we go in and create a community project. Now that could be just a solar panel to run a pump so they can get water. It could be a toilet block. You know, there's a million things. We'd have to ask those guys to say, hey, what's going to benefit you right now? And we can then donate that money to those guys. But we don't just hand the money over. We actually organize community projects and build these things out for them. So it's a full circle system that we donate these sculptures. Dive operators, hotelers have a marketing angle. They have a revenue stream that then is donated into the local communities, and those communities benefit by allowing us to put these sculptures on essentially their reefs. And Fiji is a great example of that because the Fijians own the reef rights. So you have to get permissions from the local clans, Metangalis, and local villages to say, hey, we want to do this. And they're going to go, well, what do we get out of it? Well, this is what you get.
So you're actually, you know, approaching the local communities themselves and being like, may I plant these sculptures in your reefs to raise awareness about them, generate protection, and also revenue for you folks to have these projects that you want in your communities, correct?
That is the first step we have to do. We cannot go around that step. You'll lose every single time, especially in Fiji. It's a sign of respect, and you don't want to ever disrespect the Fijian community. They're a very tight-knit community, and it's you know, if you present it correctly and they understand that there's some real benefits to it. Not only does biomass come back, like fish come back to those reefs because we're planting out the coral and rebuilding those systems so then they can fish at some point, but we're also giving them revenue in terms of community projects.
So before we get ahead of ourselves, I just want to ask you a bit, what are some of the, what's the picture really here of the global destruction of coral reefs? Can you give us some numbers and some facts, what we're looking at and what's at stake?
Yeah, so global warming is killing our coral reefs right now. So most people have heard of global warming. It's basically atmospheric heat that's building up in our atmosphere. It's trapping this heat. Now, the ocean absorbs that heat, and it absorbs about 93% of it. And there's a ton of statistics based on that. I encourage people to go and do their own research on that. But what that does is the ocean then heats up. And there's a fluctuation of temperatures that corals cannot handle. And it's only a fraction of a few degrees here and there, and then they start to bleach, and then they start to die off. And I just read a statistic today, which was a little alarming, that 75% of all coral reefs actually experience coral bleaching. And 30% of all coral reefs are currently dead, only in about 30 years. So the window is very small in terms of the devastation. 30 years, 30 to 40% of die off. They're estimating in another 30 years, we're just going to lose it all. So yeah, it's pretty tragic, to be fair.
That is incredibly tragic. Hence the name of your foundation, Counting Coral, kind of like counting, the time on a ticking clock, so to speak. So I want to ask you a little bit about your the challenges you have working with this nonprofit. What are some of those challenges, and how can folks help you out?
Well, so there are compounding problems with nonprofits right now. We're in the midst of a pandemic, global economic breakdown, and you're asking people for money. We feel bad saying, "Hey, please donate to this cause," but you got to kind of imagine it like this. I'm a homeless person, and no disrespect to homeless people. I'm a homeless person standing on a street corner begging for one dime. Now, I'm begging for that dime, not for myself, but to take that dime, put back into a system that essentially helps the person that just gave me the dime. And yet I'm in the position of begging for that money. So it's an extremely challenging situation where you're saying, "Hey, please help us out." And ultimately it's going to help you out. It falls dead, it falls flat. People aren't interested in coral. That's generally the sentiment that we've had. Now, that's not to discredit the people that are donating to us and doing that philanthropic effort. But it's really hard to get people to understand that this is affecting humanity on a level that we have not experienced yet. Coral reefs support about 25% of the population. So if I showed you a picture of a starving child, you're going to be very empathetic to that, and you're going to want to donate and help these children out, right? But you show them a picture of a coral, they don't care. But if I showed them a picture of the coral that's now dead, and 30 years from now these people are starving because they can't fish those reefs anymore, then the penny would drop. But we can't fast forward 30 years to show you these devastating images of people starving on coastal communities, and 25% of the populations will be affected by this. So it's a very hard message to send to people that you need to donate, you need to help out, you need to participate as a collective and give us the money so we can go do the good work. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to save all coral reef. And to be fair, I don't think there's much hope for large communities of coral. We are going to be shrunk down to very small pockets of coral that are going to be surviving in our oceans. We're going to lose almost all of it. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't have to have coral banks where we are converting possibly, aquariums into large coral banks where we're saving these species for later on when we have the ability to develop new strains. Even though that's happening, it's just not happening fast enough.
Well, that's a sobering picture that you've painted here. And you've kind of answered this a little bit already, but I have a question from the chat here from Sarah. Sarah wants to know, what do we need to do to restore coral reefs, and how much can we restore?
Well, again, you're kind of fighting the clock, and that's why we got the Counting Coral, the clock is ticking logo. It really is, the clock is ticking, and there is just very little hope for coral on the large scale. But what we're trying to do is save pockets of coral. So when a coral reef starts to bleach, there's a few main survivors that are just like, "Hey, I can handle this." Well, we kind of go after those species, and we kind of harvest those species because we know they're survivors, and we know that they could be planted out on the reef. And maybe that genetic encoding can now be transferred into all those cuttings to support those temperature fluctuations. Now, there's no guarantee of that. There's scientists all over the world working on what they call supercorals, which they put these corals under massive stress. So then they are now thriving in these temperatures. But there's a lot of red tape around that because they don't want to throw these corals onto reefs and then have this accidental mutation of a coral taking over a natural coral reef. So there's a delicate balance here. But we can do it. It's just got to take a massive effort on the global scale.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it's not usually the first priority on people's minds. We are, understandably so, we're concerned about, mitigating carbon, getting to net zero emissions, and then, approaching people who are working on these things and going, "Hey, can you help me restore coral?" that's a very difficult spot. That's a challenging situation to be in. And so, we're going to help you out as much as we can. And obviously talking about it more and talking about the need for it more is going to help raise that awareness. But I have another question here from Sarah. She says, where do you think coral pockets might be?
Oh, well, so there's been a new study out there that has kind of indicated that, California's having droughts right now, right? And there's various areas around the world that are having droughts. Now, they thought that was a atmospheric issue, but it's actually not. It's the tropical oceans expanding away from the tropics. So in other words, the tropics are expanding. And what that's doing is it's drawing, moisture in and pulling moisture from other places. Now, they thought it was atmospheric, but it's not. It's oceanic. So I think what's going to end up happening is in Australia, there's a line where coral just kind of stopped growing. Well, that line's going to now be moved down a little bit. And if we start to understand that and we start planting in these cooler waters that are going to warm up and we start migrating that coral down, those will be the pockets that we can survive. Because anywhere on that equatorial plane, it's pretty much devastation across the board, in my opinion. And you've got to have a little bit of foresight to see that, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, those pockets can exist and they will exist. It's just, corals can't migrate as fast as what's happening to the atmosphere. So we have to enable that for the coral. And there's obviously areas around the world that have cold water upwelling that are more than other areas. Now, those cold water upwellings cool down the reefs. And there's obviously certain current lines are just heating up around the planet, and there's no escaping those current lines unless you have massive engineering projects to cool those waters down like a conveyor belt situation. So those areas are pretty much done for, but any area that has those cold water currents coming up, those are going to be the pockets that may be able to stretch out this for another 20 years.
Well, I want to ask you a couple more questions while we have the time here. I just want to breach the actual artwork itself. Can you talk about the process about making it? How do you make these installations?
Well, it's kind of fun. I just sit there and stare at a blank wall for about an hour and go, okay, well, how could this look cool? Yeah. And then you're like, okay, well, the cool factors there, or how do we plant coral on it? Okay, well, this is how, and there's been a few instances where I spoke with a young lady down in Australia. Her name is Isabel Nunez, and she's a marine biologist working on the opal reef in the Great Barrier Reef. Mm-hmm. And now I reached out to her to talk about the sculptural designs, because you need input from biologists and experts in the field. And she's an expert in coral propagation. So I was like, hey, I've got this design, showing her all the designs and this and this. And she's like, oh man, that resembles the Okinawa installation. Now there's these guys in Okinawa in Japan that have used tubes, and they've driven those tubes into the coral reef and planted coral on them. Now, just by happenstance, I put tubes on my coral because that's how I was imagining in my mind of, well, what's the best way I can grow coral, elevate the coral so there's no sand sediment that might kill it. It's easy to work with and harvest. So then that just by happenstance happened to correlate with the Okinawa thing. And then, you got to think of actually getting these things in the water too, which is a massive challenge. So if I was in Hawaii and I go to the harbor and I say, hey, fisherman with the crane, can you give me a hand? I'll pay you $1,000 a day to crane these things over, drop them in the water. Fantastic, right? Beautiful scenario. Guess what? You go to Fiji, you're in a longboat with a 1,000-pound piece of material. You got to drop into the ocean with float bags and have safety divers and have safety protocols in place and know what could happen, what might happen. And then guess what? Your fingers crossed that nothing goes wrong with a very, very heavy object. So all of those things come into play: location, aesthetic, design, and how you're going to get these things in the water. It's quite complicated to think about it, but it's a fun process.
Yeah, so we're looking at some of the images and the videos you sent us. You actually, you do a mock-up, you make it out of wood first, and then you make it out of stainless steel. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, how do you do that? How do you make a statue out of stainless steel?
So I'm actually having a meeting today at 2 o'clock with a CAD designer. So they work in CAD. So what I do is I will do the full scale mock-up. Now the designs are so intricate on certain parts of it that we have to re-engineer that into CAD. So he's coming over today and we're going to check out the sculpture and get all the measurements because it's very complicated. The plinth and the top housing, simple, it's a circle. The bottom is a square. Everything in between is completely elaborate. So we have to reverse engineer those, get them into a CAD drawing, then we can send them over to a water jet company and they just cut them out with a water jet and then we weld them and assemble them together.
Okay, so yeah, I was assuming maybe water jet might have been used there, but I didn't want to make any assumptions. Some people.
It sounds easy, but it's not.
Yeah.
I simplified that for you.
Yeah, no, but that's and having actually welded things before in my life, it is really hard to weld. So if you're adept at that, hats off to you. Well, listen, we've reached the end of the episode. We do have about a few more questions that I want to get to in our just chatting session. It'll be about 4 or 5 minutes, but just sit tight. We are going to transition into that in 1 second. All right, and we are back. Jolyon, really amazing stuff here. And I know I've talked to you about this, but we're trying to build up our coral reef community here on Simpatico. And so my first question to you is, and you've already mentioned someone who I think we would be interested in speaking with. Are there any people that you really think we should interview here on Simpatico about coral reefs? Any marine biologists or coral reef specialists that that we should contact?
Yeah, I mean, Isabel is a fantastic resource for that because she specializes in propagation. She's been a National Geographic explorer. She's actually on the ground planting coral and doing reef restoration in the Great Barrier Reef on the Opal Reef. And then there's the obvious ones like Sylvia Earle. I don't know how difficult it is to get her on an interview, but she's one of the leading marine biologists. She's my hero. She is one of the most tenacious women on the planet. She's a little bit older in life now, but she has pioneered some of the most incredible stuff on the planet. She's managed to get one of the largest marine protected areas ever done in the world with the Obama administration. She has an organization called Mission Blue, where they create these hope spots, and hopefully once they create a hope spot, they then translate those into marine protected areas. So if you can get her, I will be tuning in.
Will do. Yeah, no, Sylvia, what was her last name again?
Sylvia Earle.
Sylvia Earle. We will make sure. And Isabel Nunez, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, we definitely would love to speak with them. I have another question here from Sarah. She said, what is the range of types of community projects you have organized?
So what do you mean by that? The range, like how many do we have in the pipeline, or?
That's a good question. I suppose you could take it from that angle. Like, how many do you have in the pipeline?
So we are in that CAD stage of one design that's going into Fiji on a reef called the Rainbow Reef, and it's a reef that's off the second largest island. Then we have another proposed installation on an island chain in the Osawa group in Fiji. We're going to focus on Fiji, to be fair. It's easier to work with the local communities. Governments are pretty much don't care what you do with coral down there, which is completely surprising to me, since it's one of the largest revenue streams that they have is oceanic type tourism. But that really opens up the door for us, because legislation in the United States and around the world is incredibly hard to break through to do good work. You have to make so many applications, so much paperwork. It's an absolute nightmare. We had many wondrous plans for Hawaii, but that went south.
Well, and that's a shame. We really should find a way to make that happen for you. And you did mention to me that you had a project that was coming up in Los Angeles. Can you tell me, tell the audience a bit about that?
Oh yeah, I'd love to. So what we're doing to raise the awareness prior to the installation is we are hopefully, COVID permitting, going to do an online exhibit of these sculptures. So we're going to try and go from San Diego to maybe San Francisco. So unfortunately right now permits to get beach events are non and void until January. Hopefully they open that up, and hopefully we get to do some temporary installations on the beaches, on those coastal communities, to raise more monies and raise awareness, because we do need more money. And the awareness driver that we try to put forth is quite inspiring when people see these sculptures laid out in the large format that we have, the way we lay them out, you know.
Well, if you make it up here to San Francisco, I would love to join you on the ground and document some of it and share it here on Simpatico. That would be really a big treat for us. So, you know, please think of Simpatico as a community that you can come to and you know, invite all your community members at Counting Coral on, and feel free to collaborate with us. We're here for you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, Julian, this was a fantastic conversation, and I will make sure that I follow up with you either later today or tomorrow, so that you have a copy of the episode to share amongst your community. But otherwise, we will be in touch. You're free to sign out of the Zoom call. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise, Mike. I really appreciate it, mate. It's any outlets that we can get to chat the chat and talk the talk is very valuable to us at this point.
All right. Well, you have yourself a pleasant day, and thank you so much for joining us.
All right, man. You too. Bye-bye. Cheers.
Bye. Well, folks, that is really exciting and interesting. I just thought when I saw the work he was doing, I was like, gotta get him on Simpatico. Such a cool guy, such great work. And yeah, we are looking forward to having more episodes on Simpatico that cover coral. And in specific, I would love to see if we could have a conversation with Isabel or Sylvia. Anyway, we are on a bit of a time crunch, so I'm going to go ahead and close it down for just a little bit to give us time for our next episode, which is going to be with Kayla and our resident atmospheric scientist, Jordan Jones. So I will see you folks soon.